The morning air was thick with humidity as the city of Hollowridge woke up to another day. The sun peeked over the skyline, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. Officer Jason Moore, a 45-year-old veteran of the force, adjusted his belt as he sat in his cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee. It was supposed to be a routine day on patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what he thought. But just a few blocks from his usual route, Jason spotted something that made him tighten his grip on the steering wheel. A sleek, black luxury car rolling through a residential neighborhood known for its predominantly white population. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his late 40s, appeared calm, nodding his head to the faint music playing from his speakers. To Jason, though, that image didn't sit right. It wasn't just the car. It was who was driving it. Jason flicked on his lights and sirens. The car slowed to a stop near the curb. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses and stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching against the asphalt. His chest swelled as he approached the driver's window, tapping it aggressively with his knuckle. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing the driver's composed face. "Good morning, officer," the man said evenly, his tone calm, his expression unreadable. Jason stared at him for a moment, his gaze shifting between the man and the spotless interior of the car. Without a word of greeting, Jason leaned in closer. "License and registration," Jason barked, his voice sharp. The man reached for his glove compartment slowly, his movements deliberate. Jason's eyes followed every motion, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "I wasn't speeding," the driver said calmly, handing over his documents. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he flipped through the papers with exaggerated slowness, looking for something, anything, that might give him reason to escalate. "What's a guy like you doing around here?" Jason finally asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. The man tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm driving to a meeting," he replied. Jason's lips curled into a smirk. "Meeting, huh?" Jason muttered, tossing the papers back at the driver without even looking at them. "Step out of the car." "May I ask why?" The man's voice was firm but not confrontational. Jason's face reddened. "Because I said so. Get out," he snapped, his hand now fully resting on the grip of his baton. The man hesitated, his eyes locking with Jason's for a brief moment. Then, with a slow exhale, he opened the door and stepped out. He stood tall, his tailored suit immaculate despite the tension thickening around them. Jason took a step closer, his posture radiating hostility. "Hands on the hood," he barked. The man complied without a word, placing his palms on the sleek surface of the car. Jason circled him like a predator, muttering under his breath, "Driving a car like this, dressed like that, who do you think you are?" Without warning, Jason spat on the man's shoes, the dark stains stark against the polished leather. The man flinched but didn't retaliate. He simply turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that Jason failed to notice. Jason, emboldened by the lack of resistance, reached for his baton. He struck the man's hand, causing him to wince but still not react violently. The silence was deafening. "I asked you a question," Jason shouted, his voice echoing through the empty street. The man straightened up slowly, meeting Jason's glare head-on. He reached into his pocket deliberately, pulling out a sleek, black wallet. From it, he produced an ID and handed it to Jason. Jason barely glanced at it before shoving it back into the man's chest. "I don't need to see that. You people always think you're above the law." The man didn't reply. He simply tucked the ID back into his pocket, his face calm but his eyes sharper now. He spoke one last time before Jason ordered him back into the car. "This isn't over." Jason scoffed as the man got into his car and drove off. He stood there, watching the car disappear down the road, shaking his head with smug satisfaction. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the words on that ID, the ones he'd ignored, read, "Chief of Police, Hollowridge." Before we continue, a quick reminder. Over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to this channel. If you believe in fighting racism and standing up for justice, please support us by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your voice matters. Join us in saying no to racism. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you are listening from. We'd love to hear from you. David Collins had no intention of letting this encounter slip away quietly. David returned to his office that same morning, his expression calm but his mind racing. He reviewed the footage from his personal dashboard camera, capturing every word, every movement, and every second of Jason Moore's behavior. The calmness David displayed during the encounter was intentional. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was strategy. This wasn't the first time David had faced racism in his career, but this time, he was in a position to do something about it. Hollowridge's newly appointed chief of police, the first black chief in the city's history, wasn't about to let this slide. The irony of Jason's actions wasn't lost on him. After carefully documenting the incident, David forwarded the footage to Internal Affairs with a concise email. Officer Jason Moore, review required immediately. The email contained no emotion, no accusations, just the evidence and a request for accountability. Meanwhile, Jason continued his day oblivious to the storm brewing within the department. He bragged to his fellow officers at the precinct about putting a guy in his place during a routine stop that morning. His tone was cocky, his words dripping with entitlement. For Jason, this was just another day on the job. But behind the walls of Hollowridge Police Headquarters, the wheels were already turning. David had instructed Internal Affairs to launch a quiet but thorough investigation into Jason's record. By the end of the day, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Complaints against Jason Moore were not new. Over the past 5 years, there had been more than a dozen filed by civilians, most of them people of color. The reports painted a grim picture: racial profiling, excessive force, intimidation. Each complaint had been buried, dismissed, or downplayed by a system that protected its own. But now, with David Collins in charge, things were different. Internal Affairs worked late into the night, pulling body cam footage, reviewing witness statements, and digging into Jason's personnel file. What they found was damning: multiple instances of unprofessional conduct, incidents where Jason's actions had crossed the line from enforcing the law to abusing his power. The next morning, David called a private meeting with the Internal Affairs team. Sitting around the conference table, the tension was palpable as the team reviewed the evidence. "We've seen this before," one investigator admitted. "But no one ever pushed for action." David leaned forward, his voice steady. "Well, we're pushing now. This department's reputation is on the line. I don't care what strings were pulled for him in the past. It ends here." As the meeting concluded, David's plan became clear. He wouldn't just suspend Jason quietly. No, this required accountability, visibility, and transparency. The public deserved to know that the department wouldn't tolerate this behavior any longer. Later that afternoon, Jason was called into a disciplinary meeting. The smug confidence he'd displayed the day before hadn't wavered as he walked into the room, a slight smirk on his face. But that smirk quickly faded when he saw the lineup of faces waiting for him. Internal Affairs officers sat on one side of the table. On the other side was David Collins, his expression unreadable. Jason hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. He didn't recognize David immediately, but could sense the seriousness in the room. He sat down across from David, still trying to piece together what was happening. "Officer Moore," one of the investigators began, "we're here to discuss your conduct during a traffic stop yesterday morning." Jason's face remained blank, but his eyes darted nervously. "Okay," he said slowly. "And?" Without another word, David reached for a remote and pressed play on the conference room's monitor. The footage of the traffic stop began to roll, filling the room with Jason's own voice, dripping with condescension and hostility. The camera captured every detail: the spit, the baton strike, and, most damningly, Jason's dismissal of the ID. Jason's face turned pale as the footage continued. His hands clenched the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. When the recording ended, silence hung in the air. David spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jason stammered, his bravado cracking under the weight of the evidence. I thought he was just another guy. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" David interrupted, leaning forward. That he deserved respect? That he wasn't a threat? Or that he was your boss? Jason's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time, he was at a loss. David continued, his voice measured but unyielding. Officer Moore, your actions during that traffic stop were not just a violation of department policy. They were a violation of basic human decency. You didn't just disrespect a citizen. You disrespected this badge, this department, and everything it's supposed to stand for. The investigators exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the gravity of David's words. Jason, on the other hand, sat frozen, his arrogance completely stripped away. As the meeting ended, Jason was informed that he was being placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The words felt like a death sentence to him, but it was only the beginning. Outside the precinct, David Collins stepped into the sunlight, his face unreadable. He wasn't celebrating. There was no victory in holding someone accountable for behavior that never should have happened in the first place. For David, this wasn't about punishment. It was about setting a standard, and he knew the battle wasn't over yet. David Collins understood the weight of his position and the storm he was about to walk into. Hollowridge wasn't just a city. It was a microcosm of larger systemic issues, and Jason Moore was a symptom of a deeper, festering problem. The investigation into Jason's misconduct wasn't just about him. It was about every unchecked act of bias and abuse that had been ignored for years. Behind closed doors, the investigation intensified. Internal Affairs combed through every inch of Jason's career, leaving no report, no file, no interaction unexamined. As each day passed, more red flags surfaced. A pattern emerged, complaints that had mysteriously gone unanswered, incidents quietly swept under the rug. One report from 5 years earlier detailed an interaction between Jason and a young black man named Terrence, who had been stopped on his way home from work. Jason had accused him of loitering, handcuffed him without cause, and held him in the back of his cruiser for hours. The complaint had been filed but was conveniently lost in the system. Another report described Jason using excessive force during a traffic stop involving a Latina woman and her teenage son. The woman had been left bruised, and her son had been traumatized. Again, the case had been marked as resolved, without explanation. David spent late nights reviewing these records personally, his jaw tightening with every page he turned. The sheer volume of misconduct was staggering. Jason Moore wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symbol of how the system had failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. But the investigation wasn't just limited to paperwork. Internal Affairs began reaching out to civilians who had filed complaints against Jason. Most were reluctant to talk, their trust in the system long eroded. But David's leadership brought a glimmer of hope. Slowly, people began to share their stories. One by one, they painted a damning picture of Jason Moore, a man who abused his authority, targeted vulnerable individuals, and weaponized his badge to intimidate and control. Their voices were raw, their pain undeniable. David listened to every word, taking it all in with a quiet determination. The media caught wind of the investigation, and the story began to spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed accusations of racial bias within the Hollowridge Police Department. News outlets ran segments on Jason's history, digging into every publicly available detail. Social media erupted with outrage, people demanding accountability, transparency, and change. Within the precinct, tensions were high. Some officers supported David's efforts, relieved to see long overdue accountability. Others bristled at the scrutiny, whispering behind closed doors, questioning why their brother in blue was being dragged through the mud. The divide was palpable. Jason, meanwhile, was unraveling. Placed on administrative leave, he spent his days at home, glued to the news, watching his name and face plastered across screens. He paced his living room like a caged animal, muttering to himself, making frantic calls to former colleagues, desperate for allies. But the walls were closing in. And then came the breaking point. One afternoon, Jason received a knock on his door. It was a process server, delivering a formal notification of the department's intent to terminate his employment pending the outcome of the investigation. Jason slammed the door shut, his face red with rage. For the first time, the reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. But while Jason spiraled, David remained steady. He knew the investigation wasn't just about accountability, it was about setting a precedent. He wanted to send a message to the department, to the city, and to the world. This kind of behavior had no place in law enforcement. David held a press conference to address the growing public outcry. Standing at the podium, his voice steady and his expression resolute, he spoke directly to the people of Hollowridge. As chief of police, it is my responsibility to ensure that this department upholds the values of integrity, respect, and accountability. The actions of Officer Jason Moore do not reflect the standards we strive to maintain. I want to assure you that this investigation will be thorough, transparent, and fair. We owe it to this community, and we owe it to every person who has ever been mistreated or ignored. The press room was silent as David spoke, his words cutting through the noise of cameras and murmurs. He didn't shy away from the truth. He acknowledged the department's past failures and promised to do better. It was a moment of raw honesty that resonated deeply with the community. Behind the scenes, the investigation reached its peak. Internal Affairs uncovered the body cam footage from several of Jason's previous encounters, each one more damning than the last. The final piece of evidence was a recording from a fellow officer's dashcam that captured Jason making blatantly racist remarks during a routine patrol. The evidence was irrefutable. Jason Moore's career wasn't just over, it was a disgrace. And yet, for David, this was never about one man. This was about changing a culture, dismantling the structures that allowed people like Jason to thrive unchecked. As the investigation concluded, David prepared for the next step, the confrontation. Jason would be brought back to the precinct, not as a respected officer, but as a man stripped of his authority, forced to face the consequences of his actions. And for David, this wasn't just about justice. It was personal. It was a chance to finally show the people of Hollowridge that no one, not even the people wearing the badge, was above the law. The morning was unusually quiet in the precinct. Officers moved about, their conversations muted, their glances stolen toward the closed-door conference room where the meeting was about to take place. At the head of the table sat Chief David Collins, calm and composed, the weight of the investigation resting on his shoulders. Jason Moore had been summoned back to the precinct. He arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in his full uniform, as though clinging to the last shred of authority he had left. His walk was confident, his head held high, but the nervous twitch in his hands betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. He was escorted into the conference room by two officers who didn't say a word. As the door closed behind him, Jason froze. David Collins was sitting at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. On either side of him sat representatives from Internal Affairs, their folders neatly stacked, pens poised. Jason's eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. "Officer Moore," David began, his voice steady but firm. "Take a seat." Jason hesitated for a moment, then sank into the chair directly across from David. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Jason shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their collective gaze. "Do you know why you've been called here today?" David asked, leaning forward slightly. Jason cleared his throat, his bravado faltering. I assume it's about the investigation," he said, his voice low. David nodded. "That's correct. Over the past 2 weeks, Internal Affairs has conducted a thorough review of your actions during the traffic stop involving me and your broader conduct as a member of this department." Jason's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly tried to mask his surprise. "I see," he muttered, avoiding David's gaze. David continued, his tone measured. "Before we proceed, I want to make one thing clear. This is not about personal grievances. This is about accountability, transparency, and ensuring that this department lives up to the values it was built on." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but David held up a hand to stop him. "Before you say anything, I'd like you to watch something." David gestured toward the monitor on the wall. One of the Internal Affairs officers pressed play, and the room was filled with the sound of Jason's voice. It was the footage from the traffic stop, every word, every action captured in high definition. Jason's face twisted with discomfort as he listened to himself berate and humiliate David. The moment he spit on David's shoes played in excruciating detail, followed by the baton strike. When the video ended, the room fell silent once again. Jason's face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "That's just the beginning," David said, breaking the silence. He motioned to another officer, who began playing a second video, a compilation of body cam footage from Jason's previous incidents. Each clip painted a damning picture: racial profiling, excessive force, demeaning language. The room grew heavier with each passing second. Jason couldn't look at the screen anymore. He stared at the table, his jaw clenched, his breathing shallow. When the final video ended, David leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "Officer Moore, this isn't just about one bad day. This is a pattern, a deeply troubling pattern of behavior that has no place in this department or any law enforcement agency." Jason finally spoke, his voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Sometimes things get heated, you know? It's part of the job." David's eyes narrowed. "Part of the job?" He repeated, his voice sharp. "Spitting on a citizen, striking them without cause, dismissing their rights. Do you truly believe that's part of the job?" Jason stammered, his confidence completely eroded. I didn't realize who you were," he said quietly, as though that made his actions any less egregious. David leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "And if I hadn't been the chief of police, what then? Would you have treated me any differently?" Jason had no answer. He sat there, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. David didn't let up. "This department has failed to hold you accountable for far too long. The complaints, the reports, the warnings, they were all ignored. That ends now." The internal affairs lead spoke next, laying out the official findings of the investigation. Jason was found guilty of multiple violations, including conduct unbecoming of an officer, abuse of authority, and racial discrimination. The recommendation was immediate termination. Jason sat in stunned silence as the words washed over him. He had no defense, no argument, no excuses left to make. For the first time, he realized there was no escaping this. David stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Officer Moore, effective immediately, you are terminated from your position with the Hollowridge Police Department. Your actions have not only dishonored this badge, but have also harmed the very community you swore to protect. You are no longer welcome here." Two officers stepped forward to escort Jason out of the precinct. As he was led away, his shoulders slumped, his steps dragging. The man who had once carried himself with arrogant authority was now a shadow of his former self. The precinct was quiet as the door closed behind him. David remained in the conference room, his expression unreadable. This wasn't a victory, not in the traditional sense. It was a necessary step, but the battle for real change was far from over. For David Collins, the termination of Jason Moore wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a larger reckoning within the Hollowridge Police Department. The investigation had unearthed more than just one officer's misconduct. It had exposed the deep cracks in the foundation of the department, a culture that had allowed bias and abuse to flourish unchecked for years. David didn't waste any time. The very next day, he called an emergency meeting with the department's leadership team. Sitting around the large conference table, the tension in the room was thick as David addressed the group. "What happened with Jason Moore isn't just about one officer," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "It's about every report that was ignored, every complaint that was swept under the rug, every person who was silenced. This department has failed the people it serves, and we have a responsibility to fix that." Some of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, avoiding David's gaze. Others nodded silently, their faces grim with the weight of his words. David laid out his plan: a complete overhaul of department policies, mandatory anti-bias and de-escalation training, and the creation of a civilian oversight board to ensure transparency and accountability. "This isn't going to be easy," he admitted. "There will be resistance, both from within this department and from outside it. But change never is. And if we're not willing to do the hard work, then we have no business wearing this badge. His words resonated deeply, even with those who had initially been skeptical of his leadership. Slowly but surely, the department began to transform. Officers who had long felt powerless to speak out found their voices. The oversight board brought fresh eyes and perspectives to old problems, holding the department to higher standards than ever before. But for David, the true measure of success wasn't just the policies or the training. It was the trust he began to rebuild with the community. He started hosting weekly town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their concerns, ask questions, and hold the department accountable. At one of these meetings, a young woman stood up and told her story. Her name was Lisa, and years ago, she had been stopped by Jason Moore for no reason other than walking through a neighborhood he decided she didn't belong in. She had filed a complaint, but nothing ever came of it. Standing there now, in front of the community and the new chief of police, her voice trembled with emotion. "For the first time," she said, her eyes welling with tears, "I feel like someone is finally listening. I feel like my voice matters." The room erupted into applause, and David felt a sense of validation, not for himself, but for the work they were doing as a collective. This wasn't about one man or one department. It was about creating a ripple effect, a change that could inspire others to follow suit. Meanwhile, Jason Moore's story didn't fade quietly into the background. His termination made headlines, sparking debates across the country about racism in law enforcement and the systemic issues that allowed it to persist. Some defended him, calling the decision too harsh. Others saw it as a long overdue step toward accountability. Jason himself disappeared from the public eye, retreating into isolation. But his name became a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when authority is abused, and a reminder of the importance of holding those in power accountable. For David, the journey was far from over. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But he remained steadfast, guided by a simple truth. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one step at a time, through relentless effort and unwavering commitment. In a reflective moment, David sat in his office late one night, the city quiet outside his window. On his desk sat the ID card Jason had dismissed during the traffic stop, the words "Chief of Police" embossed in bold letters. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, and thought about the road that had brought him here. The struggles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. He thought about every person who had been wronged, every voice that had gone unheard, and he made a silent promise to himself. He would not let their stories be forgotten. He would continue to fight, not just for justice, but for the hope that one day, the badge would truly stand for what it was meant to, a symbol of trust, integrity, and protection for all. As the clock struck midnight, David leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. The work wasn't done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. Hollowridge was changing, one step at a time, and so was he. Because sometimes, justice isn't about one moment. It's about the moments that come after. The choices, the actions, the determination to keep moving forward, no matter how hard the road ahead. And for David Collins, the road ahead was one he was ready to walk.